Have you ever wondered how nations respond to global emergencies? It's a question that might seem distant until we're in the midst of a crisis, and suddenly, the response becomes a matter of life and death. Let's start with understanding what a global emergency is. This term refers to situations that pose severe threats to health, safety, or well-being on a large scale. They can arise suddenly or build up over time, but their defining trait is the urgency and immensity of their impact. Now, when these emergencies occur, the world can't just stand by. And that's where crisis diplomacy comes in. Crisis diplomacy is the strategic dialogue, negotiations, and interactions between countries during times of severe global threats. It's like a high-stakes chess game, where the moves you make can save lives or tip the balance of global stability. The significance of crisis diplomacy is immense. It's what enables nations to collectively respond to crises, share resources, and make tough decisions. Without it, every country would be on its own, scrambling to protect its citizens without the support or cooperation from others. So, what types of emergencies require crisis diplomacy? First, we have pandemics like the COVID-19 outbreak. In these situations, nations must work together to share vital information, coordinate medical aid, and distribute vaccines. Next, there are natural disasters. When a tsunami or earthquake strikes, it's crisis diplomacy that mobilizes international aid, sends rescue teams, and helps rebuild devastated areas. Finally, we have global conflicts, situations where tensions between nations could escalate into full-blown war. Crisis diplomacy in these instances is about de-escalating tensions, mediating disputes, and hopefully preventing catastrophic wars. In all these cases, the aim of crisis diplomacy is to manage the crisis, minimize harm, and pave the way towards recovery. It's a crucial tool in our global toolbox, one that decides how effectively we can respond to the challenges that threaten our world. Now let's delve into some real-life instances where crisis diplomacy was put to the test. Remember the Ebola outbreak of 2014? Let's explore how crisis diplomacy played a role in its management. In 2014, the world was gripped by the Ebola outbreak, a global emergency that sent shockwaves across nations. This wasn't just a health crisis. It was a diplomatic challenge, a test of international cooperation and coordination on an unprecedented scale. The World Health Organization, or WHO, was at the forefront, leading the international response. But it was no easy task. The WHO had to navigate a complex labyrinth of cultural, political, and logistical hurdles, all while working to contain a deadly virus. The outbreak began in West Africa, and soon it was clear that local health systems were overwhelmed. The international community had to step in, with various nations lending their resources and expertise. But this wasn't just about sending aid, it was about coordinating efforts, aligning strategies, and ensuring that every move was a step towards containing the outbreak. And here's where crisis diplomacy came into play. You see, managing a global emergency isn't just about medical science. It's about navigating political landscapes, negotiating resources, and fostering international cooperation. It's about understanding that in a globalized world, a health crisis in one corner can quickly become a global issue. Different nations brought different strengths to the table. Some had the medical expertise, others had the logistical capabilities, and some had the financial resources. But it took diplomacy to weave these strengths together, to ensure that the response was more than just the sum of its parts. There were challenges, of course. There were disagreements on strategies. There were logistical bottlenecks, and there were cultural barriers. But through diplomacy, these challenges were addressed, and the world learned valuable lessons on how to better manage global emergencies. The Ebola outbreak indeed tested the mettle of crisis diplomacy, but it's not the only instance. Now, consider a different type of crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis. In 2011, a civil war erupted in Syria, leading to one of the most significant refugee crises in recent history. Millions of Syrians were forced to flee their homes, with no choice but to seek refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. This wasn't just a Syrian problem, it was a global emergency. The scale of the crisis was staggering. By 2020, the United Nations reported that over 6 million Syrians had been displaced within their country, while another 5.5 million had sought refuge abroad. This crisis was a colossal challenge to the international community, requiring an immediate and coordinated response. The United Nations, along with numerous humanitarian organizations, led the international response. They provided emergency aid, such as food, water, and medical assistance. But their efforts went beyond that. They also worked tirelessly to secure resettlement opportunities and asylum for the refugees in countries across the globe. However, accommodating such a massive influx of refugees wasn't easy. It required a delicate balance of diplomacy. Countries had to consider their own domestic issues, such as economic stability and social cohesion, while also acknowledging their international responsibilities. This became a test of global solidarity and humanitarian values. The international community faced numerous challenges. There were logistical issues like providing shelter and basic services to the refugees. There were also political hurdles, as not all countries were willing to open their borders. Despite these challenges, the crisis also provided lessons in crisis diplomacy. The Syrian refugee crisis underscored the importance of international cooperation in managing global emergencies. It highlighted the need for timely and coordinated responses, the value of diplomacy in negotiating complex issues, and the significance of maintaining a humanitarian focus amidst political challenges. The crisis is far from over, and the international community continues to grapple with its implications. However, the collective efforts to address this crisis have demonstrated the potential of crisis diplomacy in mitigating the impacts of such large-scale emergencies. The Syrian refugee crisis, another example of how crisis diplomacy is put to the test during global emergencies. These cases underline the crucial role of effective crisis diplomacy. It's a phrase that carries a weighty truth, especially in the context of global emergencies. When we talk about crisis diplomacy, we're referring to the collective efforts of nations and international organizations to respond to, manage, and hopefully resolve crises that have global impact. It's a complex dance of negotiation, strategy, and action, and its effectiveness can mean the difference between a crisis controlled and a crisis escalated. Let's break it down, starting with preparedness. Like a well-stocked first aid kit, preparedness in crisis diplomacy involves having the right resources, plans, and knowledge at hand before a crisis strikes. It's about understanding potential threats, mapping out potential responses, and being ready to swing into action at a moment's notice. It's the equivalent of rehearsing for a play before the curtain goes up. You wouldn't want to be learning your lines in front of a live audience, would you? Next, we have coordination. Imagine a well-tuned orchestra, every instrument playing in harmony, each musician in sync with the others. That's what coordination in crisis diplomacy looks like. It's about ensuring that the actions of different nations and organizations align towards a common goal. It's about sharing information, pooling resources, and avoiding duplication of efforts. And then there's communication. Effective communication is like the conductor of that orchestra, guiding and directing the performance. In crisis diplomacy, it's about conveying clear, accurate, and timely information, managing perceptions, and building trust among all stakeholders. But what's the underpinning foundation of all these elements? Strong international relations. It's the relationships between nations that grease the wheels of crisis diplomacy. It's these relationships that facilitate the sharing of resources, the exchange of information, and the coordination of efforts. So effective crisis diplomacy is not just about responding to crises, it's also about being prepared. It's about having the right plans in place, the right people on board, and the right relationships to lean on. Because when a crisis strikes, it's those prepared, coordinated, and communicative efforts that will make a world of difference. So, what can we learn from all this? As we've seen, global emergencies like the Ebola outbreak and the Syrian refugee crisis present enormous challenges, but they also provide opportunities for nations to come together, to collaborate, and to learn from each other. This is the essence of crisis diplomacy. Crisis diplomacy is crucial in managing these situations, not just for the immediate response, but also for the long-term recovery and prevention of future crises. It involves negotiation, cooperation, and the sharing of resources and knowledge. It's about putting aside differences and working towards a common goal: the safety and well-being of humanity. In the case of the Ebola outbreak, international cooperation and assistance were key in controlling the spread of the disease. Nations shared resources, expertise, and information, leading to the development of effective treatment strategies and eventually, a vaccine. This swift and coordinated response saved countless lives and demonstrated the power of crisis diplomacy. Similarly, with the Syrian refugee crisis, countries around the world stepped up to offer assistance, whether it was providing asylum, financial aid, or humanitarian support. This collective effort helped alleviate the suffering of millions of displaced individuals and showcased the potential of crisis diplomacy in addressing complex humanitarian crises. But crisis diplomacy is not just the responsibility of diplomats or world leaders. We, as global citizens, also have a role to play. We can contribute to global emergency preparedness and response in numerous ways. We can stay informed about global issues, support organizations that respond to crises, advocate for effective policies, or even volunteer our time and skills. These actions, no matter how small, can make a big difference. They can help build a world that is better prepared for global emergencies, a world where nations work together to respond to crises swiftly and effectively. In conclusion, crisis diplomacy is a powerful tool in managing global emergencies. It fosters international cooperation, promotes the sharing of resources and knowledge, and ultimately, saves lives. Remember, in a world that's more connected than ever, crisis diplomacy is not just for diplomats, it's everyone's business.